Who discovered the world was round? It's a question I've been asked more than once. Everyone who asks has a certain image in his or her mind of the event and the circumstances surrounding it, but I'm afraid to say that whatever image you have in your mind, it is likely wrong. Possibly the person most often credited with the discovery of the spherical Earth is Christopher Columbus, who, legend has it, had to challenge the council of his potential investors, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, who had argued that his plan to reach the Indies by sailing west was impossible because the Earth was flat. Children's history books from as long ago as 1919 cheerfully assert this claim. It is, however, a complete fiction. Columbus not only knew the world was round, but needed to convince no one else of that fact. And calling the claim fiction is not dismissive hyperbole. It is literally a work of fiction, invented by American author Washington Irving, best known for The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, in his historical fiction The Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, published in 1828. There was a debate, a heated one, about the feasibility of Columbus's voyage, but it concerned not the shape of the Earth, but its size. In order to explain further, I must first discuss the work of a remarkable man named Eratosthenes of Cyrene. Like Ptolemy, Eratosthenes was a North African Greek, though he was born about 400 years before him in the town of Cyrene in what is now Libya. A brilliant student, he caught the eye of the Greek ruler of Egypt at the time, also, confusingly, named Ptolemy, and was appointed chief librarian of the Library of Alexandria, the greatest store of knowledge in the ancient world. But Eratosthenes was not one to rest on his laurels. Not content to merely know the earth was round, he set out to determine its circumference, and he did so without leaving Egypt. His achievement has been lauded to this day both as one of the first true scientific experiments and as a masterpiece of mathematical elegance. Whatever else you might credit the Egyptians for, they were excellent surveyors, and they kept very accurate records of the distances between their cities. Eratosthenes knew that in one particular Egyptian city, called Suene, modern Aswan, the sun was directly overhead at noon on the day of the summer solstice, and so would not cast a shadow. However, in the city in which he lived, Alexandria, the sun was not directly overhead on that day, and so did cast shadows. Eratosthenes took a measuring stick, called a gnomon, placed it in the ground, and used simple trigonometry to determine the angle between it and the minuscule shadow it cast at high noon, which he found to be 1/50th the circumference of a circle. Eratosthenes reasoned that the sun was far enough away for its rays to be considered parallel lines, and since any line crossing two parallel lines makes the same angle with each line, that meant that 1/50th of a circle had to be the angular distance between Alexandria and Suene. With Egyptian surveyors informing him that the distance to Suene was 5,000 stades, he was able to assert that the circumference of the earth was 50 times that distance, or 250,000 stades. We don't know precisely what value for a stade was employed in Egypt at the time, but the common assumption is that it was the Olympic stade, which is roughly 176.4 meters in length. That would give a final value for the circumference of the earth of 44,100 kilometers, or just 10% larger than its actual value. Regardless of its results, Eratosthenes' method was flawless, and Columbus knew it. We know he did because we have his own personal annotated copy of the Historia Rerum Ubique Gestorum, or History Books of Achievements Everywhere, a kind of proto-encyclopedia written in 1477 by no less than Pope Pius II, which contained an account of Eratosthenes' experiment. Incidentally, the fact that the Pope wrote a book describing a method for deriving the circumference of the Earth should give you a fairly good idea of the Church's position on the shape of the world at the time. Of course, Columbus's detractors knew of Eratosthenes' result as well, and to them, it was cast-iron proof that his plan was mass suicide. And they were right. You have to remember that Columbus's plan wasn't to sail to any sort of new world. No one knew of the existence of the New World then, and no one had any cause to think it could be there. Columbus's plan was to sail west until he rounded the world and sneaked up on the back end of Asia, thus opening up a new route for the Asian spice trade that for centuries have been dominated by Islam. Now, for a moment, imagine a world map without either North or South America. Nothing but raw salt ocean between Lisbon and Kyoto. A panthalastic sea larger than the Atlantic and the Pacific combined. No one could cross it. Even today it would be difficult. Back then, it was slow death. So how did Columbus convince his patrons to back his expedition? Simple. He fudged the evidence. He found another proof by a Greek named Posidonius that, thanks to a series of lucky errors, managed to produce a result that was uncannily close to the true value. However, subsequent attempts by later scholars to correct Posidonius' figures ultimately produced an Earth that was up to a third smaller than reality. Needless to say, Columbus cited a corrected version. And then, in what was either a stroke of genius or desperation, Columbus located an Arabic text that appeared to give a corroborative result. Thing is, it didn't. Columbus simply didn't bother to convert the much longer Arabic miles to the European. I'll assume by mistake. But, thanks to his dodgy geometry, Columbus set out on his death ships and, by sheer luck, was saved from the inevitable by the existence of a giant, previously unknown landmass. Columbus wasn't a persecuted visionary. He was a willfully ignorant chancer who got lucky. So the ancient Greeks and Romans knew the world was round, and Europeans in Columbus's day knew the world was round. But what about the time in between? Surely knowledge of the Earth's sphericity would have been lost in the so-called Dark Ages. Well, no, actually. Although the Almagest itself would be lost to early medieval scholars in Europe, which is why we know it by its Arabic name, Al-Majesti, along with Aristotle until the 13th century, Plato's Timaeus and Pliny's Natural History, both of which argue for a spherical Earth, survived into the medieval period, though neither offered any observational evidence for their view. St. Augustine, one of the most important fathers of the Christian Church, believed the Earth was a globe, but, like many, argued against the existence of Antipodeans, literally against-foot people living upside down on the opposite side of the globe who, common sense said, would fall off. The Venerable Bede, an English historian writing in the 8th century, a man of a backwater nation just emerging from the darkest of the Dark Ages, still managed to refer to the Earth as orbis in medio totius mundi positus, an orb placed in the center of the universe. St. Thomas Aquinas, the most influential philosopher of medieval Europe, wrote in his Summa Theologica that astronomers and physicists had both arrived at the conclusion that the world was round by different means. De Sphera Mundi, the most successful astronomy textbook of the late Middle Ages, taught its many readers unequivocally that the Earth was a sphere, though the title actually refers to the celestial sphere. Those few in the Middle Ages who did argue in favor of a flat Earth, such as St. Lactantius in the 4th century, who was declared a heretic after his death, often employed the rhetoric of modern flat earthers, arguing that the round Earth was a, quote, marvelous fiction, a lie spread for malicious purposes, or, quote, for sake of jest. And after Columbus? Well, by then, the ship had quite literally sailed. There is a tendency in modern folklore to link the discovery of the round Earth to the great scientific ructions of the 17th century, when the observations of Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton eventually overturned our ancient concept of the universe. Even Thomas Jefferson, who frankly should have known better, made this error in his Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1785. Quote, Galileo was sent to the Inquisition for affirming that the Earth was a sphere. The government had declared it to be as flat as a trencher. This belief forms the core of Eric Dubay's flat Earth conspiracy theory. In his summation of his self-published work, The Flat Earth Conspiracy, he writes, quote, The Earth is flat and motionless just as it seems. The sun and moon are the same size, and all the celestial bodies revolve around us. This stable geocentric universe, proven true by experience and experiments, which reigned undisputed for thousands of years, adequately explaining all earthly and celestial phenomena, was violently uprooted, spun around, and sent flying through infinite space by a cabal of sun-worshipping theoretical astronomers. Early Masonic magicians like Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton, along with their modern Masonic astronaut counterparts like Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, hand in hand with NASA and world Freemasonry, have pulled off the greatest hoax, propagated the most phenomenal lie, and perpetrated the most complete indoctrination in history." Unquote. This is, as far as I can determine, the closest Dubé comes to proposing a rationale behind his grand conspiracy, and it is utterly, monumentally, and transparently wrong. Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton did not uproot the notion that the Earth was flat, because there was no such notion for them to uproot. The reality-altering, cosmos-upending assertion promoted by those astronomical iconoclasts was that the Earth orbited the Sun, not that it was round. Not even the most tenacious wheel-breakers of the Inquisition could have challenged them on that. Indeed, it would have been quite ridiculous for them to try. By 1610, the year Galileo turned his telescope to the sky and glimpsed the first tentative evidence of the Earth's motion, our homey planet had already been circumnavigated 9 times. So who did discover the world was round? In truth, no one knows. All we know is that, by the 5th century BC, most educated people in the Greek-speaking world accepted the idea that the Earth was a globe. Later Greek philosophers attributed the discovery to the Pythagorean school, but whether their belief in a spherical Earth was based on evidence or pure mysticism, no one can say. In short, from the 5th century BC on, there was never a time when the majority of educated Western people did not accept that the Earth was round. The idea that Columbus, Galileo, or any other specific person for that matter, discovered the sphericity of the Earth is a completely modern invention. The flat Earth, too, is largely a modern invention, and we will be looking about how it came to be in the next episode.